Habari za asubuhi. Jina langu ni Tessa.
Jina langu ni Hannah.
And we're going to take you guys to northern Tanzania today, where Hannah and I spent 4 months on our capstone project looking at local awareness and perceptions of community-based conservation, a case study that we did in Burunge Wildlife Management Area. So first we're going to go over a little bit of background information and how it pertains to natural resources and wildlife in Tanzania, starting with the people, the wildlife, natural resources, tourism, conservation, wildlife and natural resources policy, and a little bit about protected areas.
And then we'll get into our study, starting with the research questions, a little bit more information about Burunge Wildlife Management Area, a little bit of a literature review as well, get into our methods, the results, finish with the conclusions, some recommendations, and then we'll look back a little bit on some lessons learned. We're going to start with the background, beginning with our project location. So, as Tessa and Tara already said, we spent our 4 months in East Africa, Tanzania. The country overall is bordered by 8 countries, with Kenya and Uganda to the north, Congo and Zambia to the east, and Mozambique to the south. On this map, and then the maps to follow, you're going to see 2 stars. The first star is the red one, a little bit further to the top. That one's where our home base was, and then the black one is where our study site was located.
So zooming in a little bit on northern Tanzania where we were, like Hannah said, the red star is where we lived outside of a town called Mtwangu, which stands for River of Mosquitoes. There were a ton of mosquitoes there. And our project site, Burunge Wildlife Management Area, was located just about an hour south of us by car. More specifically, we were located in what's known as the Tarangire-Manyara ecosystem. And this is between Lake Manyara National Park and Tarangire National Park. And in addition to Burunge and those 2 parks, other areas of conservation are Randall WMA and the Manyara Ranch Conservancy.
So to know this area is to know the people. In Tanzania as a whole, there is roughly 56.8 million people, 47 of which live in extreme poverty. Tanzania overall is one of the most diverse countries in the world. It has over 120 tribes, each with a different social structure and language. Like many developing countries, the country is dependent on agriculture as its main economic mechanism, as well as livestock and poultry husbandry. Other economic activities include hunting, local artisanship, food vending, and various jobs in the tourist industry.
Many people consider Tanzania to be the most biodiverse country in Africa, and I think this is a great depiction of that. These are all pictures that Hannah and I took during our 4 months in Tanzania. And what we want to point out is what's known as the Big 5, which is what the animals, more charismatic animals that people tend to travel to Africa to see. And the Big 5 are the African elephants, the Cape buffalo, and next to them the African lion, also the rhino and the leopard, which unfortunately Hannah and I were not able to get pictures of while we were there.
So wildlife, while most readily visible in protected areas, also rely on areas outside protected areas called dispersal areas. In the Tarangire-Manyara ecosystem, there are 4 main wildlife corridors that move the wildlife from protected areas to these dispersal areas that are still active. The first is the Makayuni corridor, is the first one on the left, and that one connects Tarangire National Park to a really important elephant dispersal area to the northeast. The second is the Kungungero corridor, excuse my pronunciation, and that moves out the south and moves east. This is important for elephants additionally, but also wildebeest. And this area is supposed to be part of an up-and-coming WMA. Tarangire-Simanjaro corridor, is one of the most important corridors for ungulate species in this region. The Simanjaro Plains, which lie to the east of Tarangire National Park, is one of the most important wet season habitat and birthing grounds for ungulate species. The Tarangire-Manyara corridor is the last one we're going to talk about, and you'll hear again in our presentation. It's one of the most important corridors that link Lake Manyara National Park with Tarangire National Park. Thousands of wildlife migrate through this area every year.
So one of the most widespread challenges facing conservationists today globally is that of human-wildlife conflict. And human-wildlife conflict can be defined in one of 2 ways. It's actions by either human or wildlife that have an adverse effect on each other, or human interactions between those seeking to conserve wildlife and those with other interests. In Tanzania, we often see this in the form of predation of livestock, which is usually done by African lions or spotted hyenas. We also see this with crop raiding, which is done oftentimes by African elephants and by ungulate species like zebras. And there's also attacks on humans that can be done not just by carnivores, but also by animals like elephants, as well as the transmission of disease. Human-wildlife conflict also can be caused by the exclusion of people from their natural resources or protected areas for the purpose of wildlife, because that leads to negative feelings and negative views of those people towards wildlife. The responses, oftentimes we talk to people that were guarding their fields or had to guard their livestock at night to prevent losing them. Sometimes they put up fences. African elephants don't care about fences at all. And sometimes more lethal methods like retaliatory killings and poisons are used as examples. About 40% of Tanzania is covered with forests. It's a very important part of the ecosystem there, but unfortunately the country is experiencing high rates of deforestation. And this is due to clearing for agriculture, overgrazing by livestock, overexploitation of wood resources for things such as charcoal, and a severe lack of land use planning.
Water is one of the most important natural resource issues in Tanzania, especially at the community level. It's estimated that only 50% of the population has access to clean and reliable drinking water. Over 30% of rural water systems in general don't function properly, and 50% of those that function have consistent or seasonal quality issues. These quality issues mean that 50% of the main diseases that affect people in this region are waterborne. And the three main causes of death are diarrhea, acute respiratory infections, and malaria. Land overall is one of the most scarcest resources in this region. The country has extensive areas of land that can only support low populations or low intensity uses, like pastoralism. And this is because a lot of the land is dominated by rock outcrops, shallow soils, poor soil fertility, or just low levels of rainfall. Drivers of demand for land in this region include the recent droughts. A lot of communities are increasing their acreage and increasing their livestock herds to balance out the consequences. In addition, there's large-scale concerns for food security and countrywide economic growth aims, especially as it relates to the tourism industry.
So speaking of tourism, it is a pretty large industry in Tanzania. It's estimated to grow by about 30% every year and accounts for 14% of the GDP. It creates about 250,000 jobs for Tanzanians, and just in 2017 alone, it's estimated that about 2 million tourists will have traveled to Tanzania, and mostly coming from Italy, the UK, the US, Spain, and Germany. And generally, tourists spend around $2 billion on tourism to Tanzania, and this includes airline flights, hotels, safaris, climbing Kilimanjaro. And when it's all said and done, the government receives about $5.2 million in revenues from photographic tourism or safaris, and about $15 million in revenues from commercial and trophy hunting.
Tourism in the northern region of Tanzania is mostly contained within the Northern Tourism Circuit. And this is a group of 5 national parks and 1 conservation area that together make up the most visited protected areas in all of Tanzania. This includes the Kilimanjaro National Park, Arusha National Park, Tarangire, Lake Manyara, Ngorongoro Crater Conservation Area, the one and only conservation area in the country, and then Serengeti National Park, which is one of the most world-renowned national parks in the world. Arusha Town, located here, acts as the hub for the circuit and therefore is home to all of the big names in safari touring as well as conservation strategizing in the region. It also makes it one of the most populated cities in northern Tanzania after Mwanza.
So despite the government's commitment to protecting wildlife and sustainable exploitation, Tanzania is experiencing a pretty rapid decline in their natural resources, particularly in forest and wildlife. And the threats to wildlife come from climate change, a growing demand for water, illegal wildlife poaching, bushmeat and commercial hunting, tree cutting for lumber and charcoal, the pet trade, and livestock grazing. There are generally 2 different types of conservation strategies utilized in Tanzania. The first is the fortress conservation strategy, which is a pretty traditional type. It's been around for a long time. And it aims to exclude people from protected areas. So they are not allowed to live there, they're not allowed to extract resources such as forests or wildlife from that area, and it's managed by the government. So we call that top-down management. In the 1990s, the idea of community-based conservation or community-based natural resource management was born when conservationists realized that they and rural communities actually had the same goals of protecting their ecosystems and their landscapes. And this is more of a participatory approach in that local communities actually have the chance to govern and manage their own natural resources. And so this is known as bottom-up management. Now within CBC, you have kind of 2 different practices, if you will. The first is more of an idealistic way of thinking, which is called a win-win. And this is when people say, oh, well, we can improve livelihoods and meet all of those objectives and improve natural resource conservation, and everybody wins. That in reality doesn't really happen very often. More realistically, we see trade-offs that need to happen. And this is when people say, well, if we are going to improve this village's livelihoods, some of the objectives of wildlife conservation might not be met, and vice versa. So where does the conservation funding come from in Tanzania? As we mentioned, a lot of it does come from tourism and from commercial hunting, but many of it comes from NGOs and BINGOs. So NGOs are non-governmental organizations or nonprofits, and BINGOs stands for Big International Non-Governmental Organizations, which are essentially very large, well-funded international nonprofits such as the Nature Conservancy or World Wildlife Fund. It also comes from donor agencies. Donor agencies are generally government arms that offer development aid to other countries. So an example would be USAID. There are three main authorities that manage natural resources and wildlife in Tanzania. The first is the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism. They take care of the forests and the wildlife division. The wildlife division is in charge of game reserves, game control areas, and helping to establish wildlife management areas. You also have the Ngorongoro Conservation Authority, which is only in charge of Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And then the Tanzania National Parks Authority, or TANAPA, which is in charge of Tanzania's 17 national parks. And they all kind of go off of this one piece of legislation, which is the Wildlife Conservation Act, number 5 of 2009, which kind of lays the groundwork for the management of natural resources and wildlife in protected areas in Tanzania.
So these legislative frameworks have created and now manage 5 different types of protected areas in Tanzania, listed here in order of level of restrictions. National parks are going to be your most restricted and not allow any consumptive uses or human settlements within its boundaries. Conservation area, which again there's only one, Ngorongoro, does allow consumptive uses as well as human settlements, but these are highly monitored and regulated. Game reserve areas do allow non-consumptive as well as consumptive and human settlements within their boundaries, but this is all at the approval of a permit. A game control area allows non-consumptive, consumptive, and human activities, but does require permits for hunting alone. Wildlife management areas are going to have the loosest restrictions because they exist on community lands. However, they can have restrictions when it comes to wildlife and natural resource use. Wildlife management areas in particular were created to serve 2 goals. First is to protect Tanzania's wildlife and natural resources, and second to provide physical and or financial benefits to the local communities. And this is what makes it a community-based conservation strategy, that there's supposed to be benefits to both wildlife conservation or natural resource conservation, as well as communities simultaneously. In Tanzania as a whole, there are currently 21 established and registered WMAs, with 17 in various processes of being established.
So how do you set up a WMA? First, the villages need to focus on creating what's called an Authorized Association, or an AA. So villages will come together and they'll decide which of their village lands that they would like to give to the WMA. And once they decide that, they create some bylaws and they create what's called a community-based organization, or CBO. That CBO then takes the lands that they've set aside and they decide how that land is going to be used, and they create various land use plans to support that. Once they've created those, they go to the Tanzanian Director of Wildlife and they say, here's our plan for the WMA, and if he approves it, he's going to authorize or give them authorized association status. Then the CBO can also apply for rights to the wildlife on that land so that they can bring in tourists to do commercial and trophy hunting, and they can enter into investment agreements with other tourism operators. And so an authorized association is what is protecting, managing, and monitoring all of the activities within the WMA. And so here's kind of the structure of the authorized association. Again, with the WMA, we really want to focus on participatory management and getting village members to be a part of managing their resources. And so village members from all of the member villages within the WMA will be part of the Board of Trustees, the Authorized Association Council, various executive committees and subcommittees, as well as village game scouts, which are used to enforce the rules of the WMA and practice anti-poaching efforts. And so all of those village game scouts are picked out of the member villages.
So we're going to move a little bit closer to our study, what we actually did in Tanzania. Now here it's important to note that while we did originally go to Tanzania to partner with an organization, for various reasons they weren't actually in the position to direct us in a project that was both beneficial and impactful for them. So they were able to help us in many logistical capacities, but ultimately our project was independent. That means our deliverable won't go back to an organization or provide any profound findings for conservation in the region. But overall, Tessa and I did learn a great deal about conservation, leadership, and ourselves, which made the experience worthwhile.
And this is Musa. He was our Askari, or our night guard, and neighbor as well.
So we ended up working in Burunge Wildlife Management Area, as we mentioned before, which is an area of land between Lake Manyara National Park and Tarangire National Park. It's roughly 280 square miles. This was an area that was relatively easy for our in-country organization to place us in. They had a long-standing relationship as well as experience with these village leaders.
So the three main objectives of Burunge WMA is first, to conserve the forest, second, to create business and generate income for the member villages, and third, to conserve the wildlife. Burunge WMA is considered to be the most successful WMA in Tanzania out of the 21 currently registered WMAs, and it is also the most diverse in terms of languages spoken, ethnicities, and livelihood activities. It was established in 2003, but it wasn't actually registered and up and running until 2006. And it had 5 original member villages, which today have split into 10 member villages. And out of those 10 member villages, they have given a little bit over 24,000 hectares of land, or 31% of their total collective lands, to the WMA. 11 different NGOs and donor agencies are accredited with helping to set up this WMA. And these are the ones that are still providing some technical and financial support today. USAID, African Wildlife Foundation, African People and Wildlife, PAMS Foundation Tanzania, and Honey Guide Foundation.
Like the structure of most WMAs in Tanzania, the Authorized Association, JWIBU, for Burunge WMA, receives and retains 50% of all the revenues that are generated within the lands of the WMA. 50% of that is then distributed equally between all member villages. 25% is kept for operating costs, 15% for promotional costs, and then 10% is kept for savings. Over the past decade since the WMA has been established, it's had relatively constant increases in revenues. In the 2016 fiscal year, the WMA retained over $350,000 and was able to distribute just under $18,000 to each of its member villages.
There are 3 main use zones in Burunge that dictate allowable and prohibited uses within the WMA. And the first is this middle corridor use zone, which is to be used as a wildlife corridor and to maintain ecosystem health. So in that part, residents were really only allowed, if you look at this table, to collect dry firewood and non-timber forest products. The next zone is the general use zone, the larger zone, and this is an area of low conservation significance, and so village members are allowed to go in and use the resources there. In addition to the ones I just mentioned, they're allowed to graze their livestock there and to have temporary settlements. And the last down there at the bottom is the hunting use zone, and this is specifically for commercial and trophy hunting that will be brought to the WMA by tourism. In addition, photo safari and game viewing by any tourist company can be done in any of those zones. So Hannah and I, before starting our project, did a pretty significant literature review on projects that have been done in Burunge WMA. And what we found was, although it's very successful WMA on paper, it does not come without its challenges. So what previous literature has found is that top-down approaches are still being utilized. The state and NGOs are still very reluctant to give the control over to local communities to manage their own resources. They also found that there was a lack of education amongst community members. Residents didn't know about the policies in the WMA. They didn't know about the boundaries, where they were allowed to go, where they weren't allowed to go, where they were allowed to take resources or not. The WMA was doing a good job protecting wildlife, but often protecting wildlife increases wildlife numbers, which usually increases human-wildlife conflict. And the WMA has not been doing a good job in mitigating these human-wildlife conflicts like crop raiding or livestock predation. They also found that there's been unequal benefit sharing of revenues and natural resources within the WMA. Everything is supposed to be split evenly between the villages, and they found that that might not. Some villages don't think that's happening. And there's also been recorded coercion tactics used by NGOs to convince villages to join the WMA that may not have wanted to become a part of the WMA.
So given what we know about the background and what we had read about in the literature about the challenges, we decided to explore the awareness and perceptions of Burunge WMA from the village level, guided by these 3 questions. First, what is the level of local awareness of Burunge WMA from the villages located within it? Second, what are the attitudes of the local village members towards Burunge WMA? And then third, how do village members perceive Burunge WMA? Also to note here is that Jamiga, which is the authorized association of Burunge WMA, was more or less used interchangeably in the villages, and we'll also use it interchangeably in this presentation.
So again, going back to the literature, we found that there has been a lot more studies done on people's perceptions in Burunge WMA than there had been on awareness. However, there was a report done in 2010 that found of all the interviews they did in all 10 villages, only 17% of respondents actually knew that their village was part of the WMA. And then there was another study in 2007 that found residents were generally able to identify 2 out of the 3 objectives of the WMA, which was wildlife and forest conservation. More recent studies were done on perceptions, and they found that residents generally felt like they didn't really have any ownership of their own lands. And it's supposed to be this participatory management, and they just didn't really feel like that. They were being told how it was being managed. And this leads to negative feelings towards WMA officials and the WMA in general. They also found that there were too many restrictions in the WMA. People felt that they didn't have enough access to the resources they used to have access to, and that when they did break the rules, the fees and the punishments were too severe. Again, coercion into joining the WMA, many people thought that because they were coerced into joining this WMA, they did not trust anybody that pulled up in a truck with an NGO logo on the side or with the WMA logo on the side. And then there's negativity of villages towards other villages because of that unequal benefit sharing. So some villages thinking, we're giving all this land to the WMA, you haven't given any land to the WMA, yet you're receiving the same amount of revenues as we are every year.
So out of the 10-member villages of Burunge WMA, we decided to further explore this issue in 3 of them: Owasiti, Minjingu, and Vilimibitatu. These villages were chosen for 2 reasons. First, again, our in-country organization had a pretty well-established relationship with the village leaders here. And secondly, all 3 of them are located along the Arusha-Dodoma tarmac road, which is a tarmac road that goes through each of them. And that means that different parts of each village were relatively easy accessible for us.
So the first village that we went to was Owasiti. And it is the first village, if you're coming south from Arusha on the tarmac, the first village of the Burunge WMA. It's also the entry point into Tarangire National Park. There are around 4,600 residents in Owasiti, and it actually was an original sub-village of Minjingu. So it was not one of the original villages of the WMA, but it has broken off in 2010 to form its own village. The projects completed since 2016 include a community hospital in Owasiti, bathrooms for the village office, and 2 classrooms for primary schools in Luwe and Oltukai.
Our second study village was Vilimibitatu, and this is one of the 5 original villages of Burunge WMA. As of 2016, has a rough population of 5,500 residents. And it's important to know that of the 24,000 hectares of the WMA in total, half of that lies within Vilimibitatu's village boundaries. That's 65% of this village's total village land. When we were doing our surveys, we actually spoke with the village chairman, and he let us know that they were in the process of requesting that some of that land be returned to them. They believe that after the succession of those additional 5 villages, which made it 10, those additional villages didn't add land to the WMA themselves, and therefore were wrongly benefiting from the resources of Vilimibitatu. Projects completed in Vilimibitatu with WMA income since 2006 include a new primary school, teachers' homes for that school. They also provided maize for villagers during the 2011-2012 drought, and then currently they're in the process of building a hospital, which is pictured here.
So the last village that we conducted our study in was Minjiku, and it, like Itachu, was one of the 5 original members of the WMA. And it also has around 4,600 residents in it, and it is home to Minjingu Mines and Fertilization, which actually exports phosphate out of Tanzania. So back in 2003, when people were talking about creating this WMA and NGOs and the government was talking to villages about joining the WMA, Minjingu had already gazetted some land to Kibo Tourist Lodge to benefit from the revenues that that lodge would bring in and the conservation that they would practice on their village lands. So when the WMA approached them, Minjingu said, okay, great, we can have additional revenues to what we're getting from Kibo Tourist Lodge with this WMA. However, during the establishment process, Minjingu felt like there was no collaboration done between WMA officials or NGOs or the government and the Minjingu themselves, and all of a sudden found themselves a part of a WMA that they didn't even plan for or didn't even know, how it was established. So because of that, they have never formally recognized as being a part of the WMA. So if you look it up online, it says, oh, Minjingu is one of the 10-member villages. However, they do not recognize that they are. Because of that, they have refused to accept any revenues since 2006, past 11 years. And so there haven't been any projects done in their village from those revenues because they don't want them. This has also led them to file a case against the WMA for kind of coercion and wrongful being a part of the WMA. And so they've actually won that court case, and the court said the WMA had to pay them $762,000 for loss and damages done to them in the last 11 years. However, last year, the WMA appealed and said, no, we can't pay it. It should be the government that pays it. So right now, Minjingu is still kind of caught in this limbo where they haven't received any revenues, they don't want to be a part of the WMA, and yet they haven't received any of the money that they've been awarded.
So getting to our methods and our research design, we utilize the phenomenological approach, which illuminates how phenomena are perceived by individuals in a situation, and typically utilize qualitative methods to gather that data. We focused on one WMA because this would limit the variations in the contextual factors and also allow for in-depth analysis of those corresponding impacts. We chose semi-structured individual interviews because it's been shown that they tend to reveal more personal thoughts and perceptions, and since we were looking at awareness and perceptions, we decided that would probably be the most direct way to gather that data. We created a questionnaire and used it as a blueprint for our interviews, which allowed for continuity between the interviews and then also flexibility. We were allowed to explore different topics using how and why prompts. This is our interview guide here on the right. As for sampling technique, we did look at different areas of each village. These were chosen randomly, each day choosing a different direction. And also households. Some villages we used a local guide. This increased our legitimacy and chances of success. But then we also just did random house-to-house solicitation.
There were also some legal and ethical considerations we had to take into account before beginning our research. The first was to acquire 2 different research permits, the first being through TWIRI, which is the Natural Resource Research Permitting Authority in Tanzania. The second permitting being from COSTEC, which is more of the clearinghouse or the Secondary Research Permitting Authority. And once we had those permits, took about 2.5 months, we were able to get letters of introduction from the Babati District Council, in which we then took to each of the village's leadership that introduced Hannah and I and our research. So once we were done with that, we were ready to start interviewing village members. And before we began, we assured the confidentiality and anonymity to each of them. And for our data collection, our fieldwork began August 10th and went through September 1st. All of our interviews were conducted in Kiswahili or Kimasai and translated to English for us by our 2 translators. We did not record any of these interviews, and this was to ensure the comfortability of residents and to open up an avenue for more open and honest answers so we could hear what they thought about Burunge WMA. In total, we conducted 144 individual interviews, about 58 in Awasiti and 43 in Minjingu and Itachu.
So now we're going to get into our results, starting with the characterization of the participants. This is to give you an overall visual of what our respondents look like. So starting with age, the majority of our participants, 42.4%, were between the ages of 26 and 45. This was followed by the age group of 46 to 65 at 22.9%, then the age group of 18 to 25 years old at 21.5%.
Our distribution of participants by gender was pretty heavily female. 66% of our interviewees were female and 34% were male. And this was the general average in all 3 villages. Next, we asked what their primary source of income or what their occupation was. Many people gave us both primary and secondary, but you can see that the primary occupation for all 3 villages was farming. And what we'd like to point out is Ola City was the only one where another identified occupation was pastoralism. Minjingoville and Mitatu didn't really have any, but they did say that they had businesses. And we define business as selling things, having a little store, owning your own business.
We then asked participants to indicate how well they've been residents of their current village, and this is to assess kind of how involved they might be in what's going on in their community. For Ola City, the majority of our respondents tended to have just moved there, between 2 and 10 years ago having been residents, as opposed to Villa Migutatu and Minjingo, which tended to be residents who had been in that community for a longer period of time, between 16 and 35 years and or 35 plus.
So these results specifically relate to people's awareness of Burunge WMA specifically. So the first question we asked was, have you heard of Jaribu or Burunge WMA? If they said no, we ended the interview. But as you can see, most people we interviewed in all 3 villages had heard of it. And in Belima Mitatu, all 43 heard of it.
We then asked those participants who said that they had heard those terms, Jaribu or Burunge WMA, where their source of awareness was. Where did they hear those terms? Where did they get their information about these things? The majority overall identified village meetings as their source of awareness. This was then followed by seeing or speaking with an employee or just general community word of mouth.
Next, we asked them what the purpose of Burunge WMA or Jaribu was. Again, we didn't prompt them or give them any choices. And we were trying to assess the overall awareness of what the WMA was doing for them in their village. Most people identified forest conservation and wildlife conservation as what the WMA was doing. More generally, environmental conservation. And in Ola City, we actually had quite a few people say that they didn't really know what the WMA was doing in their village. We also had a few other answers, like community-based conservation, supporting villages, supporting women, employment, tourism generation, and anti-poaching and security.
We then looked a little bit more specifically at how the respondents were identifying the 3 main objectives of Burunge WMA. And again, that's forest conservation, generating income for its member villages, and then wildlife conservation in that order. So a good deal of our respondents could identify at least one of those official objectives. A slightly smaller amount could identify at least 2, but those were still good percentages. Very few could actually identify all 3 of the official objectives.
So overall, Hannah and I found that there was a pretty high level of awareness in all 3 villages of Burunge WMA or Jaribu. People either knew what it was or had heard of it in some sort of capacity. Similar to the previous findings of the literature, most people were able to identify 2 of the 3 objectives, forest conservation and wildlife conservation, with only a small percentage able to actually say, oh, I think the WMA is supporting community-based conservation or providing us income, which kind of contradicts the whole point of what a WMA is supposed to do. It's supposed to be more of that participatory protected area. Comparing village meetings to the level of awareness, previous literature has said that residents tended to go to a lot of the village meetings, yet that their awareness was pretty low. And we didn't find this to be true because of our high level of awareness that we did find. We'd ask people, how did you hear about Jaribu or Burunge WMA? And most people said, oh, from the village meetings. So we do know that people are probably hearing about that in the village meetings and that people are talking about that.
And we also thought about our results for awareness as it related to gender. So our sample was dominated by females, and this is because we think that when we were soliciting households, it tended to be between the hours of, say, 9 and 5, and this was when, in Tanzanian culture, for the most part, women are in and out of the home, as opposed to men who might be out farming, livestock herding, etc. Now, compared to the literature, our awareness results were relatively high. A lot of literature was unable to get high instances in many of these cases, but that might be related to because they also had their sample was dominated by men. They were more intentional about soliciting information from the heads of households, which in Tanzanian culture are men. So if we have a high level of awareness in our study, as well as a female-dominated sample, and the previous literature primarily had a low level of awareness and is male-dominated samples, then social studies might say that this could be because females tend to have more social responsibilities or tend to show more concerns regarding environmental issues, as opposed to men who might, because they manage monetary affairs or expenses, might make them less likely to have environmental concerns or to overutilize natural resources. Now we're going to move into our perceptions results for our study. It's important to realize here that our true results for these questions were in the form of quotes or phrases from our respondents. We coded them or simplified them for the purpose of this presentation. You may see a couple quotes up on the side of the slides, and those are just examples of the kinds of things that we heard. The first question was, do you believe Burunge WMA has been beneficial to your village? Overwhelmingly, Olasiti had the highest percentage of yes responses at 55.1%. Minjingo, on the other hand, had the highest percentage of no, we do not think this is beneficial for our village at 57.9%. Though Mitatu overall had a much more even distribution of responses at roughly 35% for all of the different identifications. So those who identified that it was beneficial, we asked them how, in what ways. For Olasiti, they mostly identified security, income, and the construction of schools as the biggest benefits. Bill Mitatu, on the other hand, identified income, healthcare accessibility, conservation, and also school construction as the biggest benefits of the WMA to their village. Minjingo, on the other hand, while they did identify benefits, it's important to realize that, again, they have not accepted any income from the WMA, so they have not actualized any projects using that income. So all the benefits they identified are hypothetical, not actually experienced. But they did identify employment, income, resource availability, and school construction as possible benefits of the WMA to their village.
So next we asked what their opinion of Burunge was. Again, we had many different answers and coded these based on positive, negative, or no opinion, neutral. And what we found is that generally in each village, people had a pretty positive opinion of the WMA at around 50%. But what's important to note here, I think, is that Minjingo had the lowest amount of neutral or no opinions, so people really seem to take a stance on, yes, this is a positive thing for our village, or no, this is not a good thing for our village. We then asked if they supported their village to continue to be a part of the WMA. Again, more people than not said, yes, we do want our village to be a part of the WMA. And what's interesting is that Minjingo, who was trying to pull out of the WMA, that more people said that they support their village being a part of the WMA. And again, not very many answers that say unsure or I don't know. People really seem to say yes, we support it, or no, we do not.
So overall, our trends followed what was identified in previous studies. Previous literature had stated that the cost of living was the major player in the perceptions of the WMA and the benefits it receives. And our results definitely supported that, and that the perceived prioritization of wildlife over the community needs was a main driver, particularly as it related to compensation and human-wildlife conflict. The positive results from Minjingo were also interesting. The literature, most respondents from Minjingo could not identify positive impacts from the WMA, overall had negative opinions. However, our results was the majority positive and supportive of the WMA. But again, it's important to recognize that the benefits they identified were hypothetical and not actually experienced. Lastly, our results still supported that there were issues at the village level with the WMA system. Again, the literature had already stated that ownership of the management had not yet been adequately decentralized. And our results supported that, and that the perceived lack of participation and collaboration with the community from the village level.
So from the literature search and Hannah and I's experience working in Burunge, we've drawn on some conclusions and recommendations for future conservation strategies in Burunge WMA. So first of all, I want to say that there are a lot of positive things going on in Burunge. It can continue to be used as a potential rural development tool and help to bring income into these poor rural communities. It does have the power to engage local communities in the conservation process, not just to conserve their natural resources, but also that they can benefit from doing so. The income has and can continue to better address important social needs that these villages have, like healthcare and schools. And it has been doing a good job at protecting the wildlife that are within the Tarangire-Manyara corridor.
However, there are some notable negatives. There is an imbalance between the benefits and the cost to communities, again, how it relates to compensation and human-wildlife conflict. There seems to be a lack of risk mitigation measures provided by the WMA that adequately protects and provides security for the livelihoods within the member villages. There also seems to be inadequate community participation and collaboration between the WMA and the member villages, which may contradict the WMA as a community-based conservation strategy. So overall, with our literature review and our experience in the field and our overall opinions, we have 3 recommendations. First, is to devolve the WMA establishment and management practices to the village level and include more participatory approaches. This would support the community-based conservation strategy idea. Second would be to increase awareness and understanding on the WMA and its importance and potential for both conservation and social development. Third, address the need for education and awareness in human-wildlife conflict so the communities can participate in mitigating these issues, both on their own and in collaboration with the WMA.
So now I kind of want to look back and do a little bit of reflection. So this is Hannah and I in Lake Manyara National Park, which is about 15 minutes from where we lived, with my fiance Sean and with our mama's daughter Clara. And this was a really special day for Hannah and I. Not only was it Sean's first safari, but it was Clara's first time. And she's 5 years old. She doesn't speak any English. She's actually our Swahili coach the whole time we were there. But we really wanted to bring her on our safari into Lake Manyara National Park because many people, kids and adults, live next to these incredible protected areas in Tanzania and never get to enjoy the wildlife or never get to see these protected areas. And so we brought her with us that day, and she got to see some of the animals and go to the parks that she may never go into again, or not, at least not for a while. And so that was really cool to have her there. So some of the lessons learned. We learned first to modify our expectations, to be adaptable and flexible. So when we were planning for this project, Hannah and I had this great 15-day timeline. We were going to get this done on this day, and this done on this day at this time. And, things just kind of started to happen. First of all, we had some permitting issues, couldn't start our research. We needed our letters of introduction. We showed up to a village one day, nobody was around. Turns out there was a funeral, and proceedings were going to last 2 days, so we were going to have to come back. And then one day after field research, our lovely Toyota RAV4 field car decided to die in the middle of the tarmac, an hour from our home, and so we were delayed 2 more days. But we adaptively managed it. We managed our schedule, we got our project done, we learned to just kind of roll with it, and I think these things that come up, we learned was just generally what happens in field research, but also what generally happens for field research in East Africa as well. What we also learned is that pole pole truly is a lifestyle in Tanzania. So pole pole is Swahili for slowly, slowly, and that's just how Tanzanians live their lives and run their government, and it was good for us because we're used to coming from this type of environment where it's go, 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 you're busy all the time, you have so many things to do. And those first few months Hannah and I were there, we were really forced to slow down and really take in our community and the people that were around us. And I think was a great learning experience for us.
Yeah. One of our other big lessons learned was just don't let the differences get you down. There were plenty of times where the people we met or the situations we found ourselves in really made us reflect on our luxuries and our experiences, especially in the Western world. And it was easy for us to let ourselves judge ourselves for mostly taking those things for granted. But along the way, we learned that it was more important to focus on how we can use those opportunities to better other people's lives and use it to move things forward, not just for the people around us, but for people around the world. Lastly, this lesson learned can be summed up in one phrase, here's home. And this was the catchphrase, I swear, of our local guide. His name is Charles. He's right there in the middle. Everywhere we go, we say, here's home, no problem. Here's home, no worries. And it was true. Tanzanians in general, they welcomed us into their homes, their community, their country in general. It was very rare for us to be intentionally made feel like an outsider, more or less. They would come in, be part of us, karibu sana, hamna shida. And even today, I still consider the people I met there, the places I went there, to be a secondary home.
And to point out, this is our mama, Rose. This is Clara's mom.
We have friendship rings.
Yeah. Okay. So lastly, we would like to thank Morty. Can't see it, but I think you're in the camera. Primary advisor for supporting us during this time, especially on our evening WhatsApp calls when Hannah would come home from the field and go, oh my gosh, what are we doing? We need help. Thank you for being there and helping us get through that whole process.
We'd like to thank our additional panel advisory members, Robin Reed and David Budd, for being so patient when receiving 7-page emergency emails in the middle of the night, as well as just being here today and spending your time with us.
Definitely want to thank village leaders and village members in Owasiti, Minjingu, and Vilima Vitatu. Without them, this project would not exist, and as Hannah mentioned, they were everyone was generally so welcoming. We'd walk up to their homes, they would get up and give us the chair they had been sitting on so that they could stand while we interviewed them. And yeah, to thank them for sitting down this 144 times and answering our questionnaires.
I'd also like to thank our translators, Boniface and Gladness, who were integral in the success of our study, but also just became really good friends for us. This is actually a picture of Boniface. We were driving home one day, and he stopped on the side of the road to pick up a piece of elephant poop, which he intended to give to his friend, who would then smoke it as a cure for his headaches.
We did offer him aspirin, but this is how they do it. And we want to give a special shout out to our mama, Rose, and her daughter, Clara, who were really our rock and our support system during our time in Tanzania. They were our Swahili coach, and they became a really important part of Hannah and I's family.
Lastly, we'd like to thank Bernard Kasui and the School of Field Studies staff and faculty, that was our in-country organization, for the logistical help that they provide us, all the free meals they provide us, and all the good laughs.
And of course, all the other friends and family we made in Tanzania, which, as Hannah said, has made Tanzania feel like a second home and a place that we look forward to coming back to.
That's one.